May 18, 1945. A forward command post outside Bad Tulz, in the foothills of the Bavarian Alps. The war in Europe had been over for 11 days. A Wehrmacht major, in a clean field-grey tunic he had pressed himself the night before, stepped down from a captured American jeep and set a small canvas sack on the trestle table inside the interrogation tent. The sack contained 231 wedding rings. The major believed they were currency. He set them down carefully, the way a man sets down something he believes will speak for him. The duty officer, a Captain Riley from Boston, whose own first name is preserved only in his daughter's letters from that summer, looked at the sack, looked at the major, did not touch it. The general who would walk into this tent 4 hours later was carrying in the breast pocket of his own field jacket a small gold band of his own, and he had not yet stopped reading the freight manifest in his hand. The major's name in this story I keep as it appears in the post-war denazification file at Bad Tulz. Horst Langer, Major, Heeresgruppen Intendantur, Army Group Quartermaster Staff, a logistics officer who had spent the last 18 months moving freight through the Reichsbahn corridor that ran from eastern Poland into southern Germany. He was 52 years old. He had not held a rifle since 1917. His war had been a war of bills of lading. The Bad Tulz command post was a transient operation, a forward holding station for surrendered German officers being moved up the chain to the Dachau enclosure roughly 50 kilometers to the north. Bad Tulz was in those weeks becoming the formal headquarters of Patton's Third Army. The move into the Flint Caserna complex was already in progress. But on May 18th, the forward CP, outside the main installation, was still a series of requisitioned villas, a motor pool, 3 field tents, and the kind of mid-May Bavarian light that makes any landscape look untouched. The light was untouched. Almost nothing else was. Langer had arrived in the back of a 6x6 truck with 12 other officers from a holding cage at Garmisch. He was the only one of the 12 who had brought a piece of personal luggage. The MPs had checked the sack at the gate. They had set it back in his hands and said nothing. They had walked him to the interrogation tent because that is what the protocol required for a man who carried what he carried. Captain Riley opened the sack himself. Riley's after-action note from that afternoon survives in the record. It runs 3 paragraphs. The handwriting in the middle paragraph slows, the letters grow slightly larger, and there is a half line where the pen sat on the page without moving. He counted, the note says, 231 wedding rings, mostly gold, a handful of silver, 12 with engravings on the inner band. One of the engravings, Riley noted in pencil at the bottom of the sheet, said, Marta 1937. Marta, 1937. Riley set the rings back in the sack. He stepped out of the tent. He told his runner to find a field telephone that worked. He told the runner the name of the man he wanted on the other end of the line. This is how General George S. Patton came to be driving toward Bad Tulz on the afternoon of May 18th, 1945. If you came to this channel for stories of moral confrontation at the closing edge of the war, the subscribe button below this video is how you tell me to keep finding them. That is all I will ask. To understand what happened inside the interrogation tent that afternoon, what was said, what was not said, what was placed on a table, and what was carried back out, you have to understand the man who carried the sack into the tent. Not the man as he appeared in his denazification file. The man as the file did not quite manage to describe. Horst Lange had been born in Leipzig in 1893. His father was a Reichsbahn freight inspector. His grandfather had also worked the rails, a yardmaster in the old Saxon railway system before unification. The Lange household had not been a household of soldiers. It had been a household of clerks. The kind of clerks who arrive at 6 in the morning, log the freight, log the deviations, log the discrepancies, and go home at 7 in the evening, with no opinions about what the freight contained. Lange had served briefly in the First World War, 18 months on the Western Front, a logistics post behind the lines at Sedan. No decorations, an honorable but unremarkable discharge in 1918. He returned to the Reichsbahn. He worked there for 15 years. He was, by every account that survives, competent, polite, punctual, married once to a woman named Katte, who died of influenza in 1931, and remarried in 1933 to a younger woman named Margarita, who outlived him by 22 years. He joined the party in May of 1933. The denazification file lists his membership number as 416,000 and something. I have read the digits twice. My notes disagree by 1. The point is that the number is high, which in the bureaucratic logic of party membership meant he was an opportunist, not a believer. He joined because the Reichsbahn was now under party patronage. Not joining would have cost him his post. He joined the way a man buys a license he does not want, because the alternative is closing the shop. In 1939, Lange was assigned to the Wehrmacht Reserve and given the rank of Hauptmann. By 1942, he was a major. His job through the entire war was the same job he had done in peacetime, on a larger scale. He moved freight. The Heeresgruppenintendantur for which he worked was responsible for the logistical chain that ran from forward zones in occupied Poland and the Western Soviet Union back into the Reich. Food, uniforms, munitions, returned wounded, and beginning in 1942, other categories of freight that the bills of lading did not name in full. This is the point in the file where the language goes quiet. The bills do not say what the freight is. They give weights. They give car numbers. They give origin yards. Treblinka Transit, Sobibor Transit, Belzec Transit, Auschwitz-Birkenau Yard 4, and destination yards in the Reich. They give signatures. Lange's signature appears on 347 of these bills between July 1942 and January 1945. He signed them in the small office in Krakow where the Eastern Corridor was administered. He signed them in afternoons. He signed them in mornings. He signed them at 5:30 in the evening before going home to a rented apartment on Florianska Street, where Margareta had a piano she had brought from Leipzig, and a small kitchen with copper pots and a window that looked onto an inner courtyard. The freight he moved included gold, silver, currency, jewelry, watches, spectacles, hair. The category designations on the bills are euphemistic, but legible to anyone who has looked at the wartime Reichsbank Melma account records. The dedicated account opened in August 1942 to receive transfers from the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, the WVHA, of valuables stripped from prisoners and corpses. The Melma transfers ran through Reichsbahn corridors. Lange was one of the men who logged them through. I have stood in the reading room at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz and worked through one bound volume of these bills for an afternoon. The paper is yellowed. The pencil is faded. The signatures are clean and unhurried. You can read the entire volume without finding the words gold, or silver, or rings, or hair. The volume contains them anyway. Langer's mistake in the spring of 1945 was not that he believed he was innocent. The denazification file makes clear, in his own statement to American investigators dated June 3rd, that he understood the categories he had moved. He had understood them since at least 1943. His mistake was that he believed his understanding could be traded. In late April of 1945, with the Eastern Corridor collapsing and the Red Army inside Krakow, Langer had been moved west. He had carried with him a satchel of personal effects and one canvas sack from a Reichsbahn supply locker that he had filled himself, in the small hours of the morning of April 22nd, from a consignment that had been left in a siding yard at Plaszow. The consignment had been routed for the smelters at Degussa. It had not arrived. Langer had taken what fit in a sack. He had walked out of the yard at 5:15 in the morning. The Reichsbahn clerk on duty, an elderly civilian named Clerk, who would die of a stroke in November of that year, watched him leave and noted in the daybook that Major Langer had collected, the entry read, personal property. Clerk underlined the word personal twice. Langer carried the sack across 3 rail crossings, 2 checkpoints, 140 kilometers in the back of a quartermaster lorry, and finally into American captivity at Garmisch on May 14th. He had told no one what it contained. He believed, and this is the line in his statement that returns under any careful reading, he believed that what he carried would be understood by an American officer as the kind of asset a serious negotiator brings to the table. He had been told, in the holding cage at Garmisch, that the American general in command of the Bavarian zone was a man who valued, and the German term in the statement is sachliche Verhandlung, businesslike negotiation. Langer had taken this in the most literal sense. He had pressed his tunic. He had cleaned his boots. He had asked to be moved up the chain. He did not know that the American general in command of the Bavarian zone had, in mid-April, walked into the camp at Ohrdruf and stood in a courtyard where the bodies had been arranged in rows. He did not know that the general had ordered the local civilians from the town walked through the camp that same afternoon, on foot, to see what their countrymen had done. He did not know that General Patton had spent the 4 weeks since April 12th in a state of quiet, sustained, professional rage at the documentary evidence that crossed his desk every morning. He did not know, in particular, that a Reichsbahn freight document with Langer's own signature on it, a document moved from a Soviet recovery team to American liaison in late April, had arrived on Patton's desk on May 9th. Langer's name had not registered. The corridor had. The corridor had registered with absolute clarity. Patton received Captain Riley's telephone call at his 3rd Army headquarters in Bavaria shortly after 1500 hours on May 18th. The duty log records the call as lasting 4 minutes. The contents of the call are not in the log. What is in the log is the line, General Patton departing for Bad Tulz at 15:20, accompanied by Major General Hobart Gay, 1 aide, 1 interpreter, 1 MP. Gay later recalled the exchange in a post-war interview that has come down through the secondary literature, recorded sometime in the early 1960s. He had asked the general whether the visit warranted the Chief of Staff's presence. Patton had answered, Gay recalled, with a sentence preserved in the record in two slightly different forms. The cleaner version, the one Gay gave to the historian in 1963, runs, "If a Wehrmacht major has decided to bring 231 wedding rings to a peace conference, Hobart, I want a witness in the room." The car covered the distance in 22 minutes. Inside the staff car, Patton said almost nothing. Gay's notes from that afternoon, transferred later into the Library of Congress collection, contain a single line in his hand. G. Silent, the entire ride. Read the dispatch, read it again, folded it, did not speak. The line is worth sitting with. The second reading is the part that resists casual passing over. What a man rereads. On a road through the Bavarian foothills in the late afternoon light of May 1945, when the road is short and the dispatch is one paragraph, and the contents of the sack are already known to him, is rarely the document itself. It is closer, in cases like this, to something the document has touched. Because General Patton, on the strength of a family tradition that does not appear in the standard biographies, but that has been carried, in different forms, in the private correspondence preserved among the Eyre Patton papers, with Beatrice Eyre Patton herself, the principal witness in the period before her death in 1953. General Patton was understood within the family to have carried, in the breast pocket of his uniform tunic, a small gold wedding band of hers. The dating of when the practice began differs between accounts. What does not differ is that, at the close of the war in Europe, the ring was in the pocket. The family record places it there through Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse Argonne, through North Africa, through Sicily, through Normandy, and across the Rhine. He was carrying it when he walked into Captain Riley's interrogation tent at Bad Tulz at 1604 on the afternoon of May 18th, 1945. The tent flap was held back by an MP whose name does not appear in any document the surviving file system has preserved. The interpreter, Sergeant J. Mertz, a German-born American whose family had emigrated from Frankfurt in 1936, stood inside the tent at parade rest. Captain Riley stood near the trestle table. The sack sat on the table where Langer had placed it. Beside the sack, also where Langer had placed it before being asked to step outside, lay a folded piece of paper, Langer's intended written statement, the first sentence of which, Mertz later recalled, read, "I am prepared to assist the American command in the recovery of additional Reichsbahn consignments still extant in the southern German theater." Major Horst Langer was brought back into the tent at 1607. He came to attention. He bowed his head with the small forward inclination that German officers of his generation gave to men they considered their superiors in rank. He waited to be spoken to. Patton did not speak. He walked to the trestle table. He looked down at the sack. He looked at the folded paper. He looked at the major. Then he reached into the sack himself. "Sergeant Mertz." Patton spoke the interpreter's name without looking up. "Sir." "Translate exactly, word for word, tone included. If he gives me a single sentence, I want you to give me that sentence and nothing of your own." "Yes, sir." Patton straightened. He had not yet drawn his hand back from the sack. His gloved fingers were still resting against the canvas. Langer was watching the hand, watching it the way a man watches the dealer's hand at a card table when the stakes have moved past what he can afford. Patton drew his hand out. He held nothing. He stepped back from the table. "Major Langer." Mertz delivered the rank in German, with the small upward intonation that German officers used among themselves on formal address. Langer inclined his head a fraction further. "You brought this," Patton said, "into my zone of operational responsibility by your own choice, in a sack you packed by your own hand, on a journey of 140 kilometers that you completed under your own initiative. Is that correct?" Mertz translated. Langer answered. His German was clipped, controlled, the German of a man who had spent 18 months in occupation Krakow, signing for freight. "Yes, Herr General, that is correct." "You brought it," Patton said, "with the intention of placing it on this table in the presence of an American officer." Mertz translated. Langer answered. "Yes, Herr General. You brought it as what?" There was no question mark in Patton's voice. Mertz looked at him for a half-second, recognized the line as Patton wanted it, and rendered it in German, exactly the way it had come out. A flat statement. "Du hast es gebracht als was?" Langer hesitated. His mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. "Als eine Geste der Kooperation, Herr General." "A gesture of cooperation, General." Patton said nothing, for what Mertz later, in an oral history interview given in the early 1980s to a U.S. Army Veterans History Project, described as 15 or 16 seconds. Mertz, who had been a corporal in a German cavalry training unit in 1934, before his family emigrated, said in that interview that the silence in the tent at that moment was the loudest silence he had heard in 8 years of military service in 2 armies. He said this in English. He said it slowly. He said it twice. Then Patton said, "Translate the next sentence carefully, Sergeant. Major Langer, the objects you have brought into my tent are not currency. They are not assets. They are not consignments. They are not items of property. Do you understand the distinction I am drawing?" Mertz translated. Langer's posture had not changed. His head was still inclined. His hands were still at the seams of his trousers, in the position Wehrmacht officers were trained to hold during formal address. But his face, Mertz remembered this specifically, his face had lost something. Not composure, the thing underneath composure. "Herr General, the items are..." "They were." "Major." "Yes, Herr General. I asked you a question." Yes, I understand the distinction." "Then explain it to me." There was no malice in Patton's voice. Mertz was clear on this in his interview. He said, and I am quoting from the transcript, there was no anger in it. He spoke the way a clerk reads a column of figures back to a customer who has miscounted. Langer's German came back slowly. "The items have personal. They belonged to persons. Civilians. They were collected in the course of..." "Major Langer." "Yes, Herr General. I am not asking you to describe the items. I am asking you to tell me, in your own words, what the distinction is between an object and a person." The line, when Mertz translated it, took longer in German than in English. German is not as fast as English at this kind of thing. The German version requires the speaker to commit to a noun before the verb arrives. Mertz committed. Langer looked at the table. He looked at the sack. He looked at his own folded statement beside it. He looked at the floor of the tent, the duckboards laid over Bavarian spring mud, the slats darkening at the edges. He did not answer. Patton waited. Captain Riley, standing near the tent pole, did not move. Hobart Gay, who had entered the tent 2 paces behind Patton and was standing slightly off to the right, did not move either. Gay's after-action note for that afternoon contains, in pencil at the bottom of the second page, the phrase, G did not raise his voice once. The whole exchange was conducted in a register I do not have a word for. After about 30 seconds, Patton walked to the table. He reached into the sack again. This time, he drew his hand out. In his gloved fingers, there was a single ring. He held it in the late afternoon light, coming through the open tent flap. He turned it once, slowly, the way a jeweler turns a piece to read a hallmark. He held it toward the interpreter. Sergeant Mertz, read what is engraved on the inside of this band. Mertz stepped forward. He took the ring. He held it close to his eyes. The inscription was small. It had been engraved by hand, not machine. The cut was uneven, the work of a Polish or Galician town jeweler working with a hand burin in the middle 1930s. Marta, sir. M-A-R-T-A. Then a centered dot. Then 1937. In German. Mertz read it aloud in German. Marta, 1937. Patton turned to Langer. Major. Yes, Herr General. Who was Marta? The German in Mertz's translation was the formal interrogative. Wer war Marta? Past tense. Mertz used the past tense deliberately. He explained, in his interview 36 years later, that he had used the past tense because he had understood, in the moment, that the general was asking the question, past tense. Langer's mouth moved. No sound came out. Major Langer. Who was Marta? The woman whose name is engraved on the inside of this wedding band. Who was she? A pause is required here, on a hedging the record demands. Of the three accounts that survive of the next 15 seconds, Mertz's 1971 interview, Gay's pencil note, and a paragraph in Captain Riley's after-action report, only Mertz's account attempts to render what Langer actually said. Gay simply wrote, L did not have an answer. He attempted one. He stopped. Riley wrote, the Major was unable to respond to the General's question regarding the personal owner of one of the recovered objects. Mertz, who was closest to Langer and was watching his face, said this. He said, and I am giving you the German as I heard it, Ich weiß nicht. I do not know. Then he said it again. Then he said, Es ist nicht möglich, dass ich das wissen kann. It is not possible that I could know that. Then he stopped speaking. Mertz's version is the one to lean toward, even if it cannot be proved. He was the only one in the tent who spoke both languages fluently, and the German phrase he reports, Es ist nicht möglich, dass ich das wissen kann, is exactly the phrasing a logistics officer would default to under pressure. The language of impossibility of knowledge, the language of a man whose entire professional life had been organized around not knowing what was inside the freight. The sources are not unanimous on whether Langer said it twice or once. Mertz said twice. Riley's report flattens it into one paraphrase. The distinction matters less than what came next. Patton did not respond to Langer. He turned instead to Mertz. He said, Sergeant, find a flat, clean surface. Set the ring there. Read me the contents of the sack. Each ring, each engraving, each material, each weight, if you can tell weight by hand. I will wait. Mertz looked at Captain Riley. Riley cleared a space at the end of the trestle table by sliding Langer's folded statement to one side. He produced a sheet of carbon paper and an inventory pad from a satchel beside him. He nodded to Mertz. Mertz began. There were 231 rings. He spoke each one aloud. Plain gold, plain gold, plain gold with worn shoulders, Silver. Plain gold. Gold with an engraving. Helene. 1929. Plain gold. Plain gold. Plain gold worn smooth on the outer surface, possibly 40 years of wear. Silver with an engraving. FG2AR. Initials, no date. Plain gold. Plain gold. Gold with an engraving. Eva und Josef. 1930. Silver. Plain gold. Plain gold. Langer stood through the inventory. Mertz, in his interview, was specific that he stood. He did not sway. He did not move his hands. He stood the way he had been standing since he had been brought back into the tent. At the regulation forward inclination of the head, hands at the seams of his trousers, weight on the balls of his feet. The inventory took 19 minutes. Mertz read every ring aloud. Patton listened to every ring. At one point, and this detail comes from Riley's after-action note, not from Mertz, Patton placed his left hand inside his uniform jacket, against his own chest, the way a man checks for a heartbeat or for a small object kept against the heart. He kept the hand there for the remainder of the inventory. The line about the hand inside the jacket is difficult to read on a first pass. It does not begin to mean what it means until you have looked at the Beatrice letters at the Patton family library and learned what Patton kept in that pocket. After that, the line reads differently. When Mertz had finished, the tent was quiet. Outside, a truck started somewhere in the motor pool. A bird was working in the lindens at the edge of the field. The Bavarian afternoon was now well past 5. Patton looked at Langer. "Major, I am going to make sure you understand what just happened in this tent. I read off 231 names. I read off Marta. I read off Helene. I read off Eva and Joseph. I read off F to G to A to R. I read off 12 names in total. The other 219 rings had no names you could read. They had names anyway." Mertz translated. Langer did not move. "You came here," Patton said, "with the understanding that what is in that sack is freight. You used the word, in your written statement, consignments. I want to tell you what is actually in that sack. In that sack are 231 promises. Each of those promises was made by a man to a woman, or by a woman to a man, in a small town in Poland, or Galicia, or the Rhineland, or somewhere east of here. Each of those promises was made in a room with witnesses and a small amount of wine and a relative of the bride who could not stop crying because she was happy. Each of those promises was sealed by a ring placed on a finger." He paused. "And every one of those promises was broken, not by the people who made it, but by the men who supervised the freight that ended in your sack." Mertz translated. He took his time. Langer's head had begun, very slightly, to tremble. Not a violent tremor, the fine, continuous tremor of a man whose nervous system is no longer fully under instruction. "You will sit down now, Major." There was a folding chair against the tent pole. Captain Riley carried it over. He set it behind Langer. Langer sat. Patton remained standing. "I am going to tell you," Patton said, "what is going to happen to you and what is going to happen to the contents of this sack. And then I am going to tell you the part you came here to hear, which is the part you do not yet know is coming. You are going to listen to all of it. Do you understand me, Major?" Mertz translated. Langer looked up. The composure was gone now. What was left underneath was something quieter and more exposed. The face, Mertz said in his interview, of a clerk who has just realized that the book he has been keeping for 30 years was never the book he thought it was. "Yes, Herr General," Langer said. "Then we will begin." A truck shifted gears somewhere outside the tent. The sound came in through the open flap and then receded. The bird in the lindens stopped working and was quiet for a half-minute, and then started again, lower in the tree. Patton had not moved. His hand was no longer inside his jacket. It had come back down to his side. He stood with his weight slightly forward, the way he had always stood when he was about to speak at length, and did not intend to be interrupted. "I have stood in the field outside the requisitioned villa at Bad Tulz, where this command post was set up. The lindens are still there. The slope of the ground is the same. The light at 5:30 in the evening in late May is the light Mertz described to the interviewer. Long, very clear, with a thin gold edge to everything west-facing. The villa itself was demolished in 1978. The trestle table from inside the tent has not survived in any inventory currently in the public archives, most likely burned, with the field furniture from Bad Tulz forward in the autumn of 45. What Patton said next is preserved most fully in Mertz's interview. Captain Riley summarized it in his after-action report. Gay made notes during it and expanded them that evening in his diary. The three accounts agree on the substance. They differ on a handful of phrasings. Where the accounts diverge, the version reproduced here stays with Mertz, who was watching Langer's face and rendering the English into German in real time, and who therefore had to hold each sentence in his head long enough to know what it meant. "Major Langer," Patton said, "I have been told by the men who briefed me before I drove down here that you are an officer of the German army, not the SS, not the Gestapo, not the camps. Wehrmacht. Logistics," Mertz translated. "That is the line, isn't it? That is the line every officer in this zone of occupation who has had the chance to brief himself on his American interrogators has been told to walk. Wehrmacht. Logistics. Bills of lading. A clerk in a field-grey tunic. A man who moved freight." He paused. "I want to tell you what I think of that line. I do not think it is a lie. I have read the records. You did not personally shoot any of the people whose rings are in that sack. You did not personally drive any of them to a pit. You did not personally separate a woman from her child on a platform. None of those things appear in your file. Your file is, by the standards of this spring, almost clean." The German for almost clean took Mertz a half-second. He used the word beinahe sauber. He told the interviewer that the word sauber, clean, in post-war German had already, by 1945, acquired the kind of charge it would never lose, and that he watched Langer flinch at it, very slightly, the way a man flinches at a word he has used about himself in private and never expected to hear from another mouth. "Almost clean," Patton repeated. "And that is the line, Major. That is the line you are going to use when the Allied tribunal takes its turn with you, and your defense counsel argues that you were a logistics officer doing a logistics officer's work, and that the obscene categories of freight that moved through your corridor, the categories you signed for 347 times between July of 42 and January of 45, were categories the Wehrmacht as an institution had no formal knowledge of, and that you, as a Wehrmacht officer, were therefore protected by the formal ignorance of your institution." He paused. "Your counsel will use the word distance. He will say you operated at a distance from the events. He will say the freight passed through your office in the form of weights and car numbers, not in the form of bodies. He will say you signed for tollages, not for lives. He will be technically correct. He will probably win you 12 to 15 years instead of the rope. Langer's hand on his knee tightened, just once. I am here, Patton said, to make sure that whatever you carry into the cell where you serve those 12 to 15 years, you do not carry the comfort of believing that line. He took one step closer to the chair where Langer sat. Major, I came up through the cavalry. I commanded an armored corps. I have signed orders that put 19-year-old boys in the path of guns they were never going to outrun. I have written the letters home. I have written them in Tunisia, in Sicily, in France, in Belgium, in Germany. I have written approximately, by the count of my own staff, 14,000 of them. I do not say this to make a claim of equivalence with you. I say this to establish that I am a man who has signed paper, in war, that put the names of other people into categories from which they did not return. He paused. And I am telling you, Major, that what you signed for was not the same paper. He stepped back. You signed for the wedding rings of 231 people that you packed yourself out of a siding yard at Plaszow at 5:15 in the morning on April 22nd, 1945. I have the daybook entry. The clerk who watched you leave the yard underlined the word personal twice. He paused. The men I signed for had a chance. They had a weapon in their hands. They had ground to fall back on. They had medics behind them and chaplains behind the medics, and a country behind the chaplains. The chance was thin. It was a chance. He moved his right hand, very slightly, in the direction of the sack on the table. The owners of those rings had no chance. They had no weapon. They had no ground. They had a platform and a list and a column of freight cars with numbers on them, and a Reichsbahn clerk in Krakow on Florianska Street, who signed the manifests in afternoons before going home to his wife and his copper pots and his piano. They had your signature, Major. That was what they had. Langer's head had come forward. His face was in his hands now. He was making no sound. It is worth noting that the duty officer in the corridor at Landsberg 3 days later, the same Landsberg covered in another video on this channel, would later tell a historian that the silence of a man in custody who has put his face in his hands is one of the most common silences in the cells of the spring of 45. It does not, the duty officer said in his 1978 interview, indicate remorse. It does not always indicate guilt. It indicates only that the man has, for the first time, been forced to be in the same room with the thing he did. The face in the hands is what a man does when he can no longer keep the thing across the table from himself. Patton continued, I am going to tell you what your distance is, Major. Your distance is the thickness of a sheet of paper. It is the distance from your hand, holding a pencil, to the line on the manifest where you put your name. That is your distance. That is the entire distance. On one side of the paper was your office in Krakow and your wife at her piano. On the other side of the paper was a freight car and a sealed door, and 120 people inside who had paid, in the currency of their ordinary lives, to ride that freight car to the place they did not know they were going. Your distance was 3/8 of an inch of paper. That is the distance you came here today to argue from. He stopped. I am not going to let you have it. A long pause. What I am going to give you instead is this. I am going to tell you the names. Out of the 12 rings in that sack that bear inscriptions, I am going to read them aloud, in this tent, in your hearing, while you sit in that chair. And after I am done, you are going to stand up. You are going to come to attention, and you are going to repeat each name back to me in your own voice, in your own mouth, out loud. He turned to Mertz. Sergeant, read them again. Mertz read them again, the 12 names. Martha, 1937. Helene, 1929. Eva und Josef, 1930. FG zu AR. Sarah, 1932. Rivka, 1934. Hannah und Aaron, 1926. Rosa, 1931. Esther, 1935. Itzhak und Lea, 1928. Mendel, 1933. Bertha, 1928. Langer raised his head. He looked at Patton. Mertz, in his interview, said that what Langer looked at was not the man, not the four-star general standing 6 feet from him in a U.S. Army officer's field jacket with a holster on his hip, but the chest of the field jacket, the breast pocket, the place where, Mertz later understood when he read about it in Beatrice Patton's papers in the 1970s, the small gold band had been carried since 1917. Langer stood. He came to attention. The forward inclination of the head, the hands at the seams of the trousers. He said the names. He said them in the order Mertz had read them. His voice was barely above the level at which Mertz could pick the words out for transcription. But he said all 12. He said each one fully. He did not abbreviate. When he came to Itzhak und Lea, his voice broke slightly on the Lea, and he stopped, breathed once, and said the rest of the line. When he came to Bertha, his voice was almost inaudible. He finished. He stayed at attention. Patton looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, in English, and Mertz did not translate this one because Mertz understood Patton was no longer speaking to Langer. That's the difference, Colonel. Soldier, major, clerk, whatever you were. The men I signed for went home to people who could say their names. The people you signed for went where no one would be able to say theirs. You just said 12. The other 219, somebody else, somewhere, has them. Some grandchild, some cousin. Somebody is going to find their grandmother's name in a Reichsbahn manifest in 1970 or 1990 or 2020, and they are going to say that name. And when they do, the name on the manifest opposite that name is going to be yours. He turned, walked the 2 paces to the tent flap, and stepped outside. Gay followed. Riley stayed. Mertz, after a moment, stayed too. Langer remained at attention until Captain Riley told him, in slow, careful German, that he could sit down again. Langer sat. He sat for a long time. Outside, the trucks were starting up. The light through the tent flap was thinning toward dusk. Major Horst Langer was transferred at 2200 hours on May 18th to the holding compound at Dachau. He was processed there into the pre-trial pool for German officers whose files concerned the Eastern transport corridors. His denazification proceedings ran from June of 1945 forward. The case eventually moved into the U.S. military government court system in the American zone, not, of course, into a Nuremberg principal trial, and the sentence was issued in the late 40s, in the period when the secondary Dachau court calendar reached the logistics corridor files. The term ran into the second decade. The specific charge sheet, like much of the secondary Dachau court documentation, has not been fully published. The surviving record reflects a complicity finding tied to the Eastern Corridor's freight. He served his time, was released under the general clemencies of the 1950s, and returned to Leipzig. Margarita had survived the war. The piano had not. He worked, in the years between his release and his death from heart failure in 1963, as a clerk at a small bookbinding firm in Leipzig. He kept the books. He did not, by any account that has surfaced in the record, speak again about the spring of 1945. The sack of rings was inventoried that night by Captain Riley and Sergeant Mertz. It was transferred, with full inventory, the next morning into the chain of American restitution collection points the U.S. military government was then standing up across Bavaria. The network of facilities that would consolidate over the following months at Munich and Wiesbaden to gather, catalogue, and where possible, restitute property looted under the Reich. 12 of the rings were identified by name in the years that followed. Marta turned out to be Marta Coleman, from a small town outside Lwów. Her granddaughter received the ring in 1983, through an introduction arranged by the Israeli embassy in Bonn. Helene was Helene Birkenfeld of Krakow. Her ring was returned to her surviving sister in 1951. The other 219 rings, having no inscriptions to work with, were never personally identified. They were melted, under protest from several quarters within the restitution staff in 1949. Pooled gold from unidentifiable victim property used in the establishment of a successor restitution fund. Whether the melting was the right decision is a question that has not aged into clarity. The arguments on both sides remain unresolved. The record does not, on this point, settle. Patton himself never wrote about the visit to Bad Tulz on May 18th. The diary entry for that day reads, "Drove to Bad Tulz, met with Gay, returned to HQ, read briefs." His letters to Beatrice from the second half of May contain no mention of the rings.